Okay. All right. Thank you. So 5-minute opening statements from both person, 5-minute rebuttal, 20 minutes of questions. In that round, somebody has 30 seconds to ask a question, a minute to answer the question, then 5 minutes of hot questions, which is where one competitor gets to go at a time and ask as many hot questions as he wants. Then the 5-minute closing statements and questions from the audience. All right. Sorry, that was a little bit fast. I'm also in the background of the chat too. So, T, you may begin.
Excellent. Well, thank you, James, Lucas, and Eric. It's a real pleasure to be here. The topic of debate this evening is evolution ubiquitous in biology? My position is yes. Not only is it ubiquitous in biology, but it is sufficient as an explanation for human origins in the phylogenetic tree of morphology, which describes us all as sharing a common ancestor with all of animal life. You see, evolution is a description of a process we observe in biology that produces genetic diversity. This encompasses many observations, but fundamentally when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about a process we observe today that results in a change accumulating over time. If you don't see it happening when we go to observe biology, rest assured it's not part of evolution. Tonight I'm going to defend a scientific hypothesis, which is an extrapolation from the observations of evolution called common ancestry, which states that we share a last universal common ancestor from which we all ultimately descend. I'm going to do so by focusing on a single set of observations regarding a single aspect of biology, but evolution as a broad topic definitely encompasses much, much more. My argument is simple. Biology explains that all animals get their mitochondrial DNA from their genetic ancestry on their mother's side. As change accumulates over time through the process of genetic recombination, new species of animals emerge, biodiversity increases, populations thrive and go extinct. But one fact remains constant. All animals have mitochondrial DNA from their genetic ancestry on their mother's side. The reason for this is way back in that genetic ancestry, an organism called eukaryotes have mitochondrial DNA. As a result, all animals share a common ancestry of eukaryotes, and the evidence of this is all animals alive have mitochondrial DNA, as did every single genetic ancestor before them, leading all the way to the distant past to eukaryotes. I'd like to point out that the whole argument here is that these types of processes of change accumulating over time, something we use the umbrella term of evolution for, is evident and ubiquitous in biology. Now, does that mean anything's been proven? No. It just means that the best explanation we have, the one supported by all the evidence, it's called evolution, and it explains why we have mitochondrial DNA. We got it from our eukaryotic ancestry. We have never lost our genetic ancestry. We are eukaryotes and we have mitochondrial DNA. We are chordates and we have a central nervous system. We are vertebrates and we have backbones. We are mammals and our females have mammary glands on their chest. We are primates and we have opposable thumbs. And it's undeniably true that we got each and every one of these traits from our genetic ancestry. And the best explanation for that fact is they are inherited from a long line of genetic ancestry leading all the way back to eukaryotes. Common ancestry is the only explanation that makes any sense at all in light of these facts. And any suggestion that any other description like special creation is relevant is simply unsupported by any evidence at all. Now, I will be the first to admit there are things about our genetic ancestry that we don't know. Many transitional forms will likely never be found. There's always going to be events in history that are forever lost. No one is disputing that. So anytime someone brings up something we don't have evidence for, remember, it doesn't matter. It doesn't address my arguments at all. Because all the evidence we do have, there's not a single piece of evidence available that would suggest common ancestry isn't the most likely explanation for why all animals have mitochondrial DNA. Not one. While every single piece of evidence we do have suggest all animals have mitochondrial DNA from their common eukaryotic genetic ancestry. My challenge to my opponent is simple. Show me one animal, alive or dead, which doesn't have mitochondrial DNA, and the evidence for how we know it does not. This single piece of evidence would call into question common ancestry and basically all of evolutionary theory, but it's never been observed, and as such, the hypothesis stands as the best explanation we have, unchallenged.
17 seconds left. Are you finished?
I am.
Okay. Eric, your turn.
Okay.
1 second. 1 second, Eric. Let me just give you the right amount of time and click on the actual time. Okay. After you go, Eric.
There are two things I find interesting that Mr. Savo just gave us, and one is I'm a big fan of mammary glands. So, I'm glad he brought that up, but I don't think they evolved. As a matter of fact, if science proves anything, science proves that we did not evolve. Science proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the theory of evolution, as it's commonly taught in our universities and our schools, cannot be true. It's absolutely impossible that it's true. Now, Mr. Savo tonight is going to give you a series of facts. Now, I'll grant that, what he says about mitochondrial DNA being passed down from, generation to generation. This is true. But the theory of evolution, the way it's taught, it works backward to what we call the LUCA, or the last universal common ancestor. And they claim that all life on Earth evolved from this one alleged common ancestor. Now, we do observe that adaptation sometimes occurs as far as the DNA will allow the species to adapt. And then when it can adapt no more to changing conditions, natural selection chooses these species for extinction. This is what we observe. We do not observe that it leads to a single cell organism evolving into every form of life that we see on Earth eventually, or any organism outside of its own kind, or family, if you prefer the classification of family. Now, this debate is important because as truth seekers, many of us take offenses against the offenses against the truth. And tonight, we're going to see that a crime against the truth has been perpetrated for decades now. And you'll see that there are people behind the scenes that are willing to distort the truth. And you're going to see that Mr. Savo agrees that there's not one thing in his conclusion that he can prove. And he has not one source that can prove his conclusion is true. So the hypothesis that he's offering you is not even falsifiable. And if it's not falsifiable, it's only as good as science fiction. If you can't falsify, let me explain something really quick about falsification. The falsification process is this. If you have a hypothesis, you have to be able to have the capacity to potentially prove that hypothesis wrong. If you don't have that potential, it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis, and it's pretty much worthless. So, who knows what the individual agendas are of the people that do distort this and protect this theory? There are people around us that have paid a very big price just for posting or for publishing their papers that go against this paradigm. Now, they weren't publishing their points of view or their thoughts on creation or their thoughts on the creation of the universe. They were publishing scientific findings and paid a price for this. Now, I do have sources for this as well, lots of sources. Now, there are people who may knowingly or unknowingly participate in protecting this paradigm when it finds itself in danger, and it forces them to betray our trust because their careers, their status, even the ability to feed their families may be put at risk. And the theory of evolution is based on the observation of adaptation and natural selection. So we do observe that adaptation occurs. We do observe this. But we also observe that species are selected for extinction. Now, there's something that I'd like for you to know. The people that I told you about that have paid a big price for this are people like Mark Armitage, who lost his employment at the California State University simply because he had the audacity to publish his paper detailing his discovery of soft tissue in an unfossilized Triceratops horn. Now, they found collagen, blood cells, they found blood vessels in this, and because he published this, he lost his job. He lost his place of employment.
Eric, I have to stop you there.
Alrighty, guys. Well, Lucas is resetting the timer. This is the period for rebuttals. T, you are first up for rebuttals. Whenever you start speaking, then Lucas will kick the timer. Also, to answer a question in the chat, we will have questions at the very end. So if you filter your questions, tag James is tired, and then I will pop those on the screen at the very end.
Excellent. Thank you, James. I wrote down a few things that Eric said. I'd like to just address them in the order he said them. The first thing he said is, I don't think mammary glands evolved. This doesn't actually explain why we would be mammals and have mammary glands. He didn't actually provide an explanation for why that would be the case, if not common ancestry. Of course, common ancestry does explain why we have mammary glands. It's because we're mammals and we got them from our mammalian ancestry. Science proves that we did not evolve. Science doesn't prove things. It demonstrates explanations more or less likely. And based upon all the observable evidence, the explanation, as I have presented it, is very likely. He said evolution cannot be true. It's impossible for it to be true. He didn't actually specify why it cannot be true or what would make it impossible, what the limiting factor is, what the actual thing that is stopping it from being true is. He said that all claim of all life evolved from Luca. In this case, that would be the eukaryote that I was referring to, the Luca. He said that kind is equal to family, and things don't evolve out of it. Of course, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the family taxon, which is part of the phylogenetic morphology taxonomy of the tree of life. The morphology goes species, genus, which is a grouping of species by common ancestor, family, which is a grouping of genus by common ancestor, and order, or class, I think it's order or class, and on and on and on up the taxonomy. All of these are just groupings by common ancestor. Of course, all of these formed because new species evolved out of their family. He said not one source can prove it. Of course I can prove it. It's easy to prove that eukaryote fossils go back 2.7 billion years. We have lots of examples of 2.1 billion year ago iron formation from that, in which the fossils of coiled forms of marine life that would stretch up to 9 centimeters were found. There was even young specimens recovered from 1.1 billion year old rocks in China. He said it wasn't falsifiable, but I actually did give the evidence that would falsify it. A single animal which does not have mitochondrial DNA would be more than sufficient to falsify this. Finally, he said it was based on adaptation and natural selection, which is, of course, patently false. Evolution is a description of a process we observe in biology that encompasses such processes as genetic recombination, changes of allele length, speciation, the new formation of taxons within the phylogenetic taxonomy of life, RNA and DNA replication. There's all kinds of aspects of evolution which are observed, which explains all of these things. But most importantly, what I think is he did not offer a a viable alternative as an explanation, which is evidence. And he did not present any evidence for this explanation, which he did not present. I think that's very interesting. Effectively, what he pointed to was a bunch of, and I hate to say it, conspiracies about people losing their jobs because they've gone against this thing and all this stuff. And maybe that's true. I'm sure that people lose their jobs over things that they say and do and publish and all that stuff. All kind of stuff happens, but ultimately, none of that actually explains why all animals have mitochondrial DNA, whereas common ancestry does explain why all animals have mitochondrial DNA. They got it from their eukaryotic ancestry. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Eric. Well, over to you, Eric, sorry. Start the timer for you. It's your time to rebuttal.
I'm sorry, what was that?
It's your time to rebut.
Okay, tell me when to start.
Okay, go now.
Okay, now what we just heard was something very interesting. First of all, we hear that science proves nothing, okay? And then we hear science proves. So I'd like to ask Mr. Savo, make up your mind, please. When you're put into a corner, does science not prove things then? Or does it only prove things when you want to assert it proves things? Now, let me point something out here. Scientists do not prove that evolution is true. On that, we will agree. Things we can prove, okay, through science, through hard science. There is something called hard science, and then there's something called hypothetical science. Now, hard science proves things like if you cross water with carbide, you produce acetylene. That is scientifically proven. Each and every time you combine water and carbide, you produce acetylene. Blood pressure meds can lower your blood pressure. We prove that in medicine and science. Science proves that heart pressure meds can increase and strengthen, heart meds can increase and strengthen your heartbeat. Science proves that we have landed men on the moon. That is possible. We can land unmanned missions on Mars. Science proves this. So yes, science, hard science, real science, legit science proves things. It's only people who have nothing more than the hypothetical science who use the excuse that science proves nothing. It's their science that proves nothing. I agree with Mr. Savo on that. His science proves nothing. Hard science, however, does prove things. Some of the things that hard science proves is that dinosaur bones cannot be tens of millions of years old. Now, I have sources that I'm going to be dropping into the link when it'll let me, and I will definitely post them in a comment, all my sources, over 20 of them, in chat or in the comments at the end of this debate. So if you want to see my sources, they're going to be there. And these sources prove that these fossils cannot be tens of millions of years old. At the very most, hard science has proven, and this is through various tests by Mary Schweitzer and her people. These are carbon-14 tests, etc. There are several different tests that prove that these dinosaur bones cannot be over 250,000 years old. And if they're not over 250,000 years old, you cannot have a Luca. You cannot have a last universal common ancestor. You cannot have a common ancestor to man and chimp. You cannot have dinosaurs, theropod dinosaurs that eventually evolve into chickens. That cannot be done in 250,000 years old. And these fossils, so-called fossils, many times are not even fossilized. Not even completely fossilized. They have soft tissue in them. This soft tissue is found, and they have tried to test to see if they can make this soft tissue last a possible 80 million years. What they were able to do was increase the half-life of an element like proteins, for instance, found in the blood by 200-fold. But 200-fold gives us at the most 250 years if you're counting collagen, which has a 117-year half-life. You actually need a over 680,000-fold increase. A 200-fold increase is nothing. But these fossils claim once you carbon-14 date them, you have a 9,000 to 40,000-year-old fossil. And the tests that were done to see how long you could preserve these proteins proved that you can't preserve them over 250,000 years. So we have consistent hard science here proving that the theory of evolution cannot be true. You cannot go back to a common ancestor. Even Craig Venter, he is the leading geneticist in the world. He's the one that mapped the human genome before teams of government scientists and world scientists across the world could map it. He concluded that there is no last universe. There is no tree of life, period. He said that it's a fiction. It's bad science. So we have to go with the hard science. The hard science tells us there is no phylogenetic tree of life. That's all completely hypothetical. There's no way to prove any of it. They don't have the DNA to prove that we're related to anything in the fossil record. That anything in the fossil record gave common ancestry to both humans, chimps, or chickens from dinosaurs, anything else. Hard science proves that just doesn't happen. And I'll yield my time.
Eric, you're done anyway, and I did give you a couple extra seconds because I started a bit late, but we're done. Okay, over to you, James. I think we're going to get to the questions.
Alrighty, guys. So in this particular round, each person gets 6 questions. T will go first, 30 seconds to ask a question. Eric gets a minute to respond, and then it'll rotate until they've been through 6 questions. Then we'll get into the 5 minutes of hot questions. T, once Lucas keys up 30 seconds, you may begin.
Okay.
Lucas, are you there with the 30-second timer?
That's 3 minutes.
I think T can do it in 30 seconds.
I bet I can. I bet I can. Eric, if we are not mammals, why do we have mammary glands?
That's the way we were created. And we are mammals. I mean, what's the question if we're not mammals?
I apologize. I should have anticipated that this round would actually go a lot quicker. So, Lucas, don't worry about putting the timer up. If you want to go on camera, just keep like a timer to the side because I don't think the question's going to go over 30 seconds. I don't think this response will go over 30 either.
Yeah, and to just finish my response, there's no problem with us being mammals. We are mammals, okay? That's just a human classification. We created all kinds of classifications. Mammals, reptiles, you name it. We have the species, we have families, orders, kingdoms, phylum, etc. So there's no problem. We fit into the classifications that we created.
And how are those classifications formed? What's the criteria for forming those classifications?
It depends on the classification. Species, for instance, the formation of the definition of species, it would be like organisms that are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring.
Okay. And the rest?
Well, it's all different criteria. It just depends on your classification.
Pick one.
Hey, this is what, question 4?
No. This is the second question, actually.
Well, I think you've surpassed your second question.
No, I asked you to describe the criteria by which these taxons were formed. You only described one of them.
That's right. You want me to sit here and describe every single one of them?
Yeah, because there's only one criteria for the other one.
For what other one?
All the other ones.
Pardon me, but that's just not so.
Yes, it is.
So,
the criteria is that they are...
Judges, is he going to have the opportunity to...
The criteria...
And just say that this is just the second question?
The criteria for both...
1 second, guys. So I'm giving you guys a little bit of liberty to clarify the questions. When you get to ask your question in a minute, then you'll get to have that same leeway. It won't be like you'll be admonished or anything like that. So no worries, Eric.
Okay, well, I would like to know which specific classification he wants me to.
All the taxons above species. They only have one criteria. It's a common criteria for all of them.
Well, no, that's not so. Go ahead.
Okay, so the common criteria is it's all groupings by common ancestry. That's it. That's all we're talking about.
Well, but that's not so.
Okay. Next question.
I want to give you an example of this, okay? We have, we would group dire wolves as ancestors to the wolf. Am I not right or wrong?
I don't have that information in front of me.
Yes, for generations now, we've classified the dire wolf as a wolf, an ancestor to the wolf. And I have a source that I'm going to be dropping into the chat box as well as the comments after the end of this debate. All of my comments or all of my sources are going into that box. And you're going to see evidence that proves, DNA evidence that proves that the dire wolf is not ancestor to the wolf. So there you go. Your hypothesis is completely shot.
I don't see how, but let's move on. You said we were created. What is the mechanism of creation, and what is the evidence for it?
The evidence for our creation?
No, the mechanism first, please.
Well, God. God is all powerful. God is able to create.
Okay.
But the
specific mechanism, please.
What is the specific mechanism that we use to create anything as human beings? Okay. God has the ability, if God is God, and we assume that God is God, or else we wouldn't believe in God. The God that we believe in is all powerful, almighty. So he is able to create. Okay. Now, what God did when he created mankind, we see that he created mankind. He formed mankind from the dust of the earth, and then he breathed into him the breath of life. Now, let me explain to you. We take abiogenesis, for instance. Abiogenesis is the idea that you can take that organisms just form randomly and pop to life, and yet we can take every building block of life, pile it up together, put it in any environment that we want to create, and we can create any environment that we can imagine, and we can shock and electrocute it, strike it with lightning, you can irradiate it, and it just lays there. It has no breath of life. It cannot animate. You cannot make it animate. Now, if you observe nature, okay, nature observes that it takes a life to create a life. Life does not just randomly form. Nature teaches us this 1 billion times a day if you include the creation of new life in bacteria, plants, animals, people, etc.
I think we're really off topic at this point. The question was, what is the mechanism and what is the evidence for it?
I told you God is God. That's the mechanism.
I mean, that's not actually a mechanism,
that's
right?
My answer.
That's a thing, right?
1 second. Let me just say, even if you don't feel you've got your answer, maybe Eric asked some questions might get to answer. So let's just give him some time to ask.
Yeah, I'd just like to know the evidence for it. Moving on from the, it's not a mechanism, but
the evidence for it is that the nature that we observe. I answered that. We observe that life brings forth a life, and it doesn't come about any other way that we observe. Okay, the only thing you observe, Mr. Savo, is that it takes a life to bring forth a life. That's what you observe. Okay? Now, you want to deny that when you take it back to the first life. You want to deny that and say, no, it just randomly formed and popped to life. You have absolutely zero evidence for that. But we do have all the evidence in the world that it takes a life to create a life.
Okay. My final question, isn't that just an argument from ignorance?
No, that's an argument from observation.
Okay,
that's what we observe.
Okay, we don't need to address that. Let's just leave that for there. And Eric, would you like to start questioning T?
Okay, T, do you claim evolution is a fact? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Now, how do you prove evolution is a fact?
You don't. You demonstrated the most likely explanation.
So evolution cannot be a fact. It is an assertion. Now, in our pre-debate discussion, okay, when we were negotiating, you claimed.
Eric, please don't bring up things from outside this
No,
debate.
let's
address things that are in this debate, please.
Yes,
you know
this is relevant to the debate.
Just things have been brought up today, and he has brought up.
This is relevant to the debate. You claim that we had DNA evidence that proves that we have a common ancestor before mankind.
Eric, he hasn't stated that this debate.
Would you please? This is just debate, Mr. Moderator. This has nothing to do with any other question.
I think we can. I think he can phrase the question based on what he thinks T might answer, and that would be okay. I don't think he's trying to necessarily reference a conversation earlier, but just what he believes T's position is.
Yeah, no, it's your position, is your stated position that we had the DNA evidence to prove Homo erectus is our ancestor, the ancestor of Homo sapien, Neanderthal, and Denisovan.
Was that a question?
Do you still hold that position?
I don't know what you're referring to.
Do you still hold the position that Homo erectus?
I don't know what you're referring to, Eric.
You don't know what Homo erectus is?
I've not mentioned anything about that in this debate.
Okay, I didn't say you did mention any of this debate.
Okay, well, let's stick to the debate then.
Is it your position that we have DNA evidence that proves Homo erectus is our ancestor?
I don't have that information in front of me at the moment.
Okay, the answer is no, we do not. Okay, that's okay. Now, if evolution is not a fact, and evolution is a postulation, a hypothetical postulation, do you mind telling people that it's a fact anyway?
I don't accept your premise.
Does it bother you to claim evolution is a fact when in fact it's not a fact?
I don't accept your premise.
Well, okay. What is a half-life?
The approximate amount of time that on average a nuclear radioactive isotope will decay 50% of its mass.
Okay. So if collagen has a half-life of 117 years, if 10 half-lives come and go, how much time has passed under normal circumstances?
I don't have that information in front of me. That's a sixth question right there.
Yeah.
Well, I have 5 minutes to ask this.
No, you had 6 questions actually.
Hold on.
Eric, this next part is the part where it's just 5 minutes. You can redirect as many questions as you want.
Okay.
So T will get 5 minutes. Lucas will put it on the timer. He won't be able to go past 5 minutes, and then you'll get 5 minutes. You can cut him off, interrupt, anything you like to do during that time.
That's fine.
You can go ahead and start, Eric. I'll yield the floor to you.
No, it's your turn.
No, I'm happy to yield. I don't have anything to ask, so it's going to be really boring. Oh, I'm happy to.
Just to clarify, T, you want to yield your 5 minutes of asking Eric questions during the hot question round?
Correct.
Okay.
So you're not okay. So you
Eric,
say
5 minutes on the clock. Hot question round.
Okay, let me know when to begin.
Timer started.
Okay, it's easy math. You have a 117-year half-life. At the end of 10 half-lives, how much time has passed under normal circumstances?
Sorry, is that a question? I don't have that information in front of me.
That would be 1,170 years. It would just be 117 years by 10. So if you multiply 1,170 years by 200, how many years do you have?
Are you asking me? Because I don't have that information in front of me.
You have 234,000 years. Again, it's very easy math. Okay, so how long have we been finding dinosaur bones with soft tissue?
I don't have that information in front of me.
Okay, I'm going to produce a peer-reviewed paper from Mary Schweitzer that proves and actually states that we've been finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones since the 1960s. But nobody here has ever heard about that, until this new peer-reviewed paper come out. So they've been hiding from everybody the fact that since the 1960s, and this goes uncontested in peer-reviewed journals, that since the 1960s, we've been finding soft tissue in these dinosaur bones, and that information has been kept from the public. Why?
I don't have that information in front of me, Eric.
Well, doesn't it seem obvious they're protecting evolution?
I don't know what's to protect.
Now, isn't it true that human beings have DNA proves that we have interbred and produced fertile offspring with Neanderthals and Denisovans?
The evidence certainly would suggest that is likely.
Yes, I have the peer-reviewed papers to prove that too. Okay, now define species.
The largest grouping of genetic organisms which can all interbreed and produce viable offspring who can in turn interbreed and produce viable offspring.
Okay, and the fact that we've done so with Denisovan and Neanderthal shows that we are indeed the same species, and yet evolution would have us to believe that they are cousins. That's the way it's taught. They are our cousins, so they are misleading us too.
So that would be a ring species, right?
Well, no, that is the same species.
No, that would be a ring species.
We crossbred, we produce fertile offspring, and yet they're called cousins.
So like I said, that would be explained by ring species.
Well, that doesn't explain that.
Yes, it does.
Prove there are ring species and not a species.
Well, you just did.
No, you need to prove it.
No, you just did.
You just defined species, and then we just observed that Denisovans, you admit Denisovans, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens all interbred and produced offspring, which fits the criteria, the very definition that you gave to the listener, to me, to the moderator. So there you go.
Okay, so like I said,
you can't prove they're a ring species. You're asserting it.
You just did prove that they are ring species.
Nobody proved
the evidence that they are ring species is that they did interbreed and produce viable offspring.
You just said that was the definition of species. Now make up your mind. Which is it?
I am specifying that there is a distinction between species and ring species.
And what is the distinction?
The distinction is that a species is the largest grouping of organisms which can produce viable offspring, who can in turn interbreed and reproduce viable offspring. Whereas a ring species is a set of species which can interbreed, like A can breed with B and B can breed with C and C can breed with D, but D cannot breed with A.
Well,
that's a ring species.
We have proven that Neanderthals interbred with Denisovans, Denisovans interbred with Neanderthals. We've proven that both of them interbred with us, and we've all interbred with each other's offspring. That is proven. So by your definition, we are the same species and not a ring species.
No, by my definition, they are a ring species.
I'm done with this BS right here. Maybe we move on. I yield my time, and we go on to the next portion.
So, as I was saying, they are ring species because they all can. Excuse me, they are all ring species because they can interbreed.
Guys.
No need to talk over me. I'm just saying.
Your time is up. I'm just saying.
Eric, you don't need to moderate.
As Eric gave up his, as Robert gave up his time to you, Eric. Yeah, Eric, Robert, if you just want to address the last bit, then we'll finish.
So, as I was saying, a ring species is a classification.
He had a minute to answer his question. That minute has come and gone.
But he has given his time to you, so just
a real quick.
Okay.
Because then after that, Robert will be doing his 5-minute closing statement, and then you'll have the final closing statement before we do questions.
So as I was saying, the distinction between a species and a ring species is that species cannot interbreed with other species, but ring species can interbreed with species within their ring. That is literally the definition of ring species. And so by virtue of the fact that these different species could all interbreed and produce viable offspring, by definition, that would be classified as a ring species.
No, now you're changing your story.
That's done, Eric. You can address it in your closing statement, mate, and we'll move on. James?
Alrighty, T. 5 minutes is queued in, so you can do your 5-minute closing. Don't forget, guys who are watching, if you have questions for the panelists, throw them in. What we'll do is, if the question's for T, we'll give Eric a chance to respond real quick after. If the question's for Eric, we'll give T a real quick chance to respond to that as well. You may begin, T.
Okay,
Excellent.
T, sorry.
Thank you. So I think my opponent has really made an excellent job of done a really excellent job of making my point for me. Evolution is a description of a process that we observe in biology. If we don't observe it, we're not talking about evolution. And what he's talking about is things that, we don't observe. We don't observe God making things. We don't observe, creation, a special creation. We don't observe any of these things. What's more is this is a hypothesis that he put forth with no evidence to support it and no method of falsification for it. These are not scientific hypotheses. These are not scientific theories. These are not scientific conclusions. However, the observation that we have mitochondrial DNA and all animals have mitochondrial DNA is a scientific observation. There has never been an example of a single animal which did not have mitochondrial DNA. What's more is my opponent has completely failed to understand the nature of the phylogenetic tree of life. Species form when allele links change, such that the ancestral population can no longer interbreed with the divergent population with the changed allele links, and this is how new species form. And when this happens enough times, what forms is what's called a genus, which is just a grouping of these species by common ancestry. And when that happens enough times, what happens is what forms as a family, which is just a grouping of genus by common ancestry, followed by an order, which is just a grouping of family by common ancestry, followed by class, which is a grouping of order by common ancestry, followed by phylum, which is a grouping of class by common ancestry, followed by kingdom, which is a grouping of phylum by common ancestry, followed by domain, which is a grouping of kingdom by common ancestry, followed by the overarching life. All of these things fall under the taxon of life. My opponent has offered no rebuttal to this that makes any sense at all. He has offered no evidence that this should not or could not be true. He has talked about dinosaur bones and given information that frankly doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. The evidence, the suggesting that dinosaur bones are, less than 10 million years old, that's just not supported by any observations. You won't find a peer-reviewed article that actually says that this is reality. What you will find is lots of creationist articles, and I can only imagine that that's where he's getting his information from, is creationist articles. He said we're created, didn't give a mechanism, just hand-waved about dirt and God and all these things, none of which is very convincing to me at all. Meanwhile, we observe genetic recombination. We observe changing allele links. We observe new species forming. We observe all of these things, and all of these things are sufficient to support the taxonomy that I have described in terms of groupings by common ancestry. There is nothing in anything that has been said tonight which would challenge anything which I have said. I yield the remainder of my time.
All righty, thank you for that closing statement. Lucas is going to queue up 5 more minutes, and then once you see the 5 minutes up, Eric, he'll tell you when to go.
Okay, Eric, off you go, mate.
Okay, you're going to find tonight, by the end of the night, that I am the only one that's going to provide you links. I am the only one that's going to give you scientific references. I am the only one that's going to give quotes from each and every one of these that prove scientific articles that are not creationists, but they're in peer-reviewed journals, not written by creationists, but written by people who are not creationists. Now, you're going to find Craig Ventnor, for instance, facing down Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, telling them to their face, there is no tree of life of common descent. And if Craig Ventnor, the world's leading geneticist, tells you this, well, then certainly Savo cannot trump Mr. Craig Ventnor. You're going to find Mary Schweitzer is the one who wrote the peer-reviewed article, and it is accepted by other scientists in peer review, not a word of it is actually disputed, that they were only able to prolong soft tissue 200-fold its half-life. Now, if you take the half-life of 117 years collagen and you multiply it by 10 half-lives, you have 1,170 years, and you multiply that 200-fold, as you're going to see in the quotes that I provide with the link to her peer-reviewed article, you're going to come up with 234,000 years. You're going to find that Mr. Savo is the one that's not offering you a link, not offering you anything that backs his conclusion. He doesn't have a quote where he can prove a common ancestor to anything. And if we have 250,000 years, under 250,000 years for these dinosaur bones, I also have a peer-reviewed article that I'm going to give you from a secular scientist who was attacking the creationist points that every dinosaur bone that we have ever tested, submitted to C14 tested, has been tested to between 9,000 to 40,000 years. Now, if you combine that with Ms. Schweitzer's tests that say they can't be under 250,000 years, you have several sources saying that these things can't even be 1 million years old. And that's using their science, secular science, not creationists. Okay? Now, this paper is a hostile witness in my favor, because it does say that this has happened. These bones were tested. They were not completely fossilized. They've been finding them since the 1960s unfossilized. It's been hidden from you because this is a protected paradigm. And the fact that they are found with C14, being C14 rich, he attributes this to the possibility that it possibly seeped in, which he's attacking his own dating methods. He's attacking all radiometric dating. So you can't trust the 80 million year timeline anyway. Not only can they tear up their own timeline by attacking their dating methods. And so if you add up what Craig Venter told us, if you add up what Mary Schweitzer tells us, these are observable facts. These are the tests that prove evolution cannot exist. You don't have time for a Luca, last unified common ancestor. You don't have time for a common ancestor from mankind and chimp. You don't have time for dinosaurs to evolve into chickens. You don't have time for any of this. All you have time for is nothing. Nothing. We were created as we are. Do we observe extinction? Yes, we do. We do observe that almost all life that's ever existed on Earth has been selected to go extinct. Do we observe that we have a common ancestor? No, we don't. We have Mr. Savo's hypothesis that does not rest at all on hard science. Hard science proves his hypothesis is not even possible. You're going to see these links tonight. I'm going to put them in chat if it will allow me. I tried to put the first set in and it wouldn't allow me. I will, however, put them in the comments. And if you want to see it, just look for my very first comment and you're going to see every source that I'm using, along with a quote from that source. And Mr. Savo fought very hard. I fought to use sources for our listeners.
Alrighty. Eric, that was 5 minutes. Thank you very much. If you send me all the links, I'll put them in the video description along with everyone else's link.
I'll be happy to do that too, James, despite claims that I would not.